Hi, everyone. It's rare that I'm really impressed by works of criticism, but ever since I read Edward Said's Orientalism, I really have been interested in it as a genre, and learning about different critics and different schools of criticism and all of that good stuff. I think I read Orientalism in college sometime, and didn't really know anything else that Edward Said had written about. And then I think in my sophomore year of college, he passed away. And this was actually the last book that he wrote, the one I'll be talking about right now. It's called On Late Style, Music and Literature Against the Grain. If you've heard about Edward Said, it's probably because of his book Orientalism, which was published about 35 or 30 or so years ago. Probably one of the most recognized and important contributions to post-colonial studies. And as I said, he wrote these essays. It is an essay collection on late style shortly before his death. The sense of lateness, what he's talking about when he uses the word late style, is the sense of mortality and the sense of obsolescence, which is obviously very important to him. He knew he was dying. He had leukemia. And that sense of obsolescence and lateness and mortality permeates these essays. And the essays are really broad in subject matter. They cover everything from the music of Strauss, Mozart, and Beethoven to the political activism of Jean Genet, the writer, to Il Gattopardo, both the novel version and the film version by Lampedusa and Visconti, respectively. In many ways, this is Said's last conversation with Theodor Adorno, who is another critic that very much interests me, whose presence also really deeply informs the criticism that's in these essays. The book begins by reading around lateness as an aspect of chronological development, as synonymous with maturity, which is how we usually read it, and opens up the concept of as something that we can realize intransigence, difficulty, and unresolved contradiction, instead of the facile harmony and resolution that seeks the end of all tension. Said claims that late style refuses to reconcile what is impossible, and that this reconciliation is oftentimes just a refusal to accept difference. He says, quote, "It grasps the difficulty of what cannot be grasped and then goes forth to try anyway." Musicologist Rose Sabatnik says that the late work of Beethoven, no doubt with his Missa Solemnis, or maybe the Ninth Symphony in mind, that, quote, "No synthesis is conceivable, but is in effect the remains of a synthesis, the vestige of an individual human subject sorely aware of its wholeness, and consequently the survival that has eluded it forever." It's this idea of lateness, which is quite distinct from, but not completely unrelated to, mortality and death, which Said puts to critical use in these really well-wrought essays. And while I think that everything in the book is worth reading, a few essays especially jumped out at me as worthy of attention. In the essay titled "Return to the 18th Century," he sets out to carve a middle path between two radically different opinions of the operas of Richard Strauss. Adorno's rejection and derision of them is total, as you'll know if you're familiar with Adorno's writing on musicology, saying that, quote, "He intended to master music without submitting to its discipline." That's a German observation, if ever there was one. And that, quote, "His ego ideal is now fully identified with the Freudian genital character, who is uninhibitedly out for his own pleasure." So compare this with Glenn Gould's hagiographic characterization of Strauss as, quote, more than the greatest man of music of our times. In one of the most convincing arguments that I think Said makes in the book, he argues against Adorno's accusation of Strauss being a kind of Biedermeier relic, and that he went a long way in countering Wagner's theatrical idiom of, quote, history as a grand subject to which everyone and every small narrative is subject, and becoming the keeper of the art of our fathers. The most interesting and readable essay in the collection, I would say, is called, quite simply, On Jean Genet, which is an autobiographical account of Said's two encounters with Genet during the early 1970s. The second of these took place in Beirut and allowed Said to learn Genet's role in his Palestinian activism, about which Said is also very passionate himself. Through a reading of Les Paravents, Said argues that because of Genet's lifelong marginality as a thief, prisoner, and homosexual, that he was able to sympathize with Palestinians without the Western rose-colored glasses of Orientalism. And you can say hello to my cat now. This is Ziggy. Hello, Ziggy. I'd recommend this for anyone especially interested in classical music. For Said admirers who have only special special knowledge of him as a literary critic, these essays sort of open up new vistas by displaying the full panoply of his concerns and his academic interests. And while I have the suspicion that a lot of musicologists would disagree with some of his characterizations of, for example, Mozart and late Beethoven and maybe Strauss, these are nevertheless really interesting, well thought out pieces of criticism. And of course, they're all the more poignant because Said knew that he was in his last stages of his fight with leukemia. And readers who admire Said for his clear presentation of sometimes very opaque ideas won't be disappointed here. I really enjoyed this. Really good. I'm not sure what else I've read by Said other than Orientalism, but finishing this certainly wanted me to pick up some more. On Late Style, Music and Literature Against the Grain by Edward Said, featuring Ziggy the Cat.